the history of Southeast Asian history. So if you look at one of the many essays that's been written about the history of Southeast Asian studies or the history of the writing on Southeast Asian history, what you'll find is a similar pattern. Basically, people start out by talking about the colonial era, which is when Westerners first started to study about the region. And in doing so, many scholars or the writers of essays about this topic will talk about how there were biases in the work of colonial era scholars, that they were more Euro-centric and perhaps paternalistic. And of course, that they were written in a time when these scholars generally accepted the colonial world order. So in these essays, they then go on to talk about the rise of area studies after World War II, and area studies is presented as a correction to these earlier colonial era biases. And basically, that's where the story ends. Area studies emerges, it develops, everything is fine. Then, of course, the 1990s, things start to change. You've got globalization, and then in the 21st century, you have the digital revolution. All of this has a negative impact on area studies as a field, but people don't question the actual scholarship itself or the content, and people don't characterize it in the same way that they do for colonial era scholarship by saying it had a certain kind of bias or something like that. But if we do actually look at things and try to characterize it, I think we can see a clear bias in area studies scholarship. So what is the bias? Well, just as every era has its politics, area studies emerged in a time period that had its own politics, and in particular, it was really politically charged. In the 1960s and 70s, when Southeast Asian studies was really taking off at places like Cornell and in America and the English-speaking world more generally, this was the time of the Vietnam War. And there was a strong sense among scholars, or young scholars at that time, that the knowledge that they produce could be used in perhaps dangerous ways by entities like the US government, and that they could use that knowledge for very destructive purposes. So starting in the 60s and 70s, a lot of these scholars had a clear desire to try to present a picture of a place like Southeast Asia as a place that really had a lot going for it, that was a picture that was very positive, and in many ways to try to show that this is a place that, if anything, America should be learning from rather than destroying. And so you have all of these positive attributes that became part of the general sort of canon of Southeast Asian studies knowledge. What are these ideas? Things like the supposed autonomous status of women, or the higher position of women in Southeast Asia in the past in contrast to other areas of the world. The idea that political entities in the past were not as clear-cut, as rigid, or as, say, oppressive as in other parts of the world. And with that, you have ideas like the mandala, which supposedly described a sort of powerful center that just had these kind of fuzzy edges, not really clear boundaries that were governed over like they were supposedly in other parts of the world. That's a problem, but we'll just go with this. Then as for that power, it's something that was more benevolent. The idea of the man of prowess is someone who sort of has this power that people recognize, and it's all kind of happy and everyone gets along. That was another aspect of this kind of canon of ideas. There are many, many others. The idea that for warfare, people were interested in capturing people rather than land, and therefore warfare was supposedly less bloody or destructive. and on and on and on. So essentially, what these scholars did was to create a picture of Southeast Asia as this really beautiful place that really, if anything, this is a model that the rest of the world should be following. And this, I argue, is clearly connected to the politics of the generation that created this scholarship. This is the post-war generation, the people who are referred to in America as the baby boomers, and I therefore refer to the politics that are linked to the scholarly production of this generation as baby boomer politics. It was a politics that led these people to try to create a very positive image of this distant part of the land, in part as a way to educate their fellow citizens about the kind of positive, beautiful world that they wanted to see emerge in places like America, the UK, or really the rest of the world. So yeah, it was a beautiful thing, a beautiful idea, but it didn't really explain reality or depict reality all that clearly. And that's why I think we need to move on to a post-baby boomer politics age for area studies to continue to be relevant. So another way of looking at this is to look at the change that enabled area studies to emerge. You had the colonial era with colonial era scholarship, and then you had massive political change. World War II, decolonization. So area studies scholarship emerged in a world where the ideas of the colonial era simply couldn't exist anymore. They just didn't make sense anymore. Well, in recent years, we haven't had a world revolution, we haven't had a world war, but we've had transformations which arguably are just as big, if not bigger. Globalization and the digital revolution have transformed the world so radically that, yeah, we can keep producing the kind of ideas that were produced in the world of baby boomer politics, Southeast Asian studies, but they don't really make sense anymore. And this is why that's the case. Increasingly, the people who are interested in the kind of knowledge about Southeast Asia that is produced by area studies people is not the traditional audience. The audience that the baby boomer politics area studies world was producing scholarship for was what I call the guy or gal in the cornfield. It was for the person who didn't know anything about this area, and it was supposed to give them a more worldly sense of things and to make them think twice about their own identity as, you know, self-righteous, superior Americans or, you know, whoever. The people who are interested in this scholarship or this body of knowledge now, I would argue, are increasingly people from the region, because with globalization, economic development, and the digital revolution, you have more and more people in the region, particularly younger people, who are more globally educated and who are curious to know more about their own society beyond what they've learned in their society. And what they've learned in their societies is a vision of their society and its history that in a lot of ways is very positive, just as the baby boomer politics area studies version of the past and Southeast Asian societies was. The type of knowledge that's produced in Southeast Asia or presented in schools is more nationalistic, and people realize there's something not quite right about that. But turning to baby boomer era politics scholarship that talks about how wonderful Southeast Asia was in the past, that doesn't answer the questions that people have. They want to know, why is gender inequality so deep in my own society? And other things about their society which are not as nice as they have been presented. And so what this requires, I would argue, is a new type of scholarship that really doesn't try to present a beautiful picture of a society or the past, but just tries to present an accurate picture of a society and its past. And that can include talking about stuff that just isn't very nice. But ultimately, that gets to something more realistic. Southeast Asia is not a part of the world that's more beautiful than any other. It's just as messed up, just as problematic, just as screwed up as any other place in the world, and that's always been the case. And so if we're going to look at our own societies and look at the good and the bad, you have to do the same for a place like Southeast Asia. But this, I would argue, is something that the politics of the baby boomer area studies didn't really engage with. And so what I argue that we need is for a kind of scholarship that becomes increasingly questioning of the received knowledge. Yes, some people could say that, well, cultural studies is critical. Yeah, but only of certain things in certain fashionable ways. There's more fundamental things out there that I think we can look at just in being critical in the sense of questioning why do we think the way we do, and to go beyond this and to really try to get a more accurate understanding of the past. So baby boomer politics, yes, they exist. Yes, they have had a huge impact on Southeast Asian studies. And yes, there's something we definitely need to move beyond.